Good morning. I wasn't really satisfied with the title of my talk when I chose it because ethical ecology and indigenous people, it sounds a little common, and it doesn't do justice to all that I want to say today. I want to say things that are full of the tragedy, the irony, the hope, the potential of this story. But I'll do the best I can. I'm going to start with the irony of the fact that I am talking about the fate of indigenous people of North America and our current ecological crisis. I'm a city boy with a large carbon footprint, and I'm a product of a power structure that brutally marginalized and abused indigenous populations. I'm a pretty typical, mediocre, liberal example of environmental consciousness, although I'm trying to change. And obviously, I cannot speak for indigenous people. So I begin by acknowledging my limitations, the limitations of labels that I've used, such as indigenous populations, which itself was a compromise from numerous conversations. Best of all is to call each tribe by their chosen name, but I needed an umbrella term. Now, schooled as a youth in the inappropriateness of the term Indian, I assumed that the vocabulary had gone full circle, given the fact that the Smithsonian built down on the mall the National Museum of the American Indian. Now, that's certainly better than the District of Columbia's other label for indigenous people, the offensive but legally protected and commercially valuable term redskin. But nevertheless, American Indian still raises some objections. So there's no perfect umbrella term. I'm going to use a few labels, but mainly indigenous people. But more substantively, I'm also limited by the historical research that I could do because the reality is that they all are perspectives from outside of indigenous cultures by and large. You can find some primary sources, but history is usually written by the winners, and indigenous populations usually are not the winners. Last week I was talking to Lenape Chief Shelley DePaul, who told me that not a single history of the Lenape people of this area was written by a Lenape native. So her work, which includes in general part of our summer program at Camp Linden, is to share the wisdom and the ways of the Lenape people. And I hope you support Camp Linden. There's some information there. I'll talk a little bit more about this camp and Shelley's work. Now, in my life and my teaching, I've learned that the dominant culture generally ignores indigenous wisdom at its own peril. I think it's both ironic and tragic that given the growing possibility of environmental collapse, we continue to ignore what might be our greatest hope for survival, and that's the ethical and ecological worldview of indigenous peoples. By the way, this worldview has a lot in common with ethical humanism, actually. Both respect relationships, they both value interconnectedness, and both are rarely heard in mainstream culture. Indigenous people, along with their wisdom, often comes to us through stories, simple stories. But these are often marginalized by our greedy and giddy capitalist culture. I mean, we know that, right? All of us do. But how well do we know it? How well do I know it? Given the fact that I'm awfully comfortable in my very consumerist lifestyle. So I want to try to get a little bit less comfortable by exploring some of the ecological wisdom and our relationship with the Lenape, but first I want to get into the history, and that's where the discomfort is clear. We've all been schooled in it one way or another, but I don't think many of us have read the 1881 book by Helen Hunt Jackson called A Century of Dishonor, which she wrote as an attempt to humanize U.S. policy regarding indigenous peoples. She researched the first 100 years of our policy towards American Indians, and she was so shocked that she couldn't stay silent. She wrote in a letter to a friend, "I shall be found with Indians engraved on my brain when I'm dead. A fire has been kindled in me that will never go out." She sent a copy of her book to every member of Congress in the hope of reversing what she said was our country's road to a century of dishonor. Now, dishonorable behavior obviously did not start with the founding of the United States. Columbus, who was unable to return to Europe with the gold he promised investors, harvested the next most valuable thing: human beings. The Arawak people of the Caribbean were the first North American victims of the European slave trade. Columbus began a long trend of this with the religious justification that he gave, and these are his words: "Let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, go on sending all the slaves that can be sold." Well, this was, for the indigenous people, the reward that they got for being incredibly generous to the oddly dressed and often violent visitors from the East. So from the military conquest to bribery to paternalistic manipulation, the record is shameful, clearly. And despite the idealism of the revolutionary period of American history, where the rights of human beings were put forward, when the 1783 Treaty of Paris was signed and cheered by Washington and his French allies, it was an unmitigated disaster for indigenous people. Immediately after that, the first 3 years of policy treated indigenous people as if they were imperialist foes, with state governments often wreaking the most damage on these populations. Well, with a nod towards a certain degree of mutual respect, Washington's Secretary of War, Henry Knox, proposed a slightly different response. He got the president thinking with the following words. He said, "How different would be the sensation of a philosophic mind to reflect, instead of exterminating a part of the human race, that we had imparted our knowledge of cultivation and the arts to the aboriginals of the country by which the source of future life and happiness had been preserved and extended." He continued, "But it has been conceived to be impractical to civilize the Indians of North America. This opinion is probably more convenient than just." Well, the president tried to balance convenience and justice by settling on what he called a civilizing process, right? Rather than genocide. Knox convinced Washington to restrain the state governments by gaining federal jurisdiction over the tribes. And the wording in 1787 of the Commerce Clause, as it became known, of Article 1 of the Constitution, extended jurisdiction as follows. It said that the federal government has the right to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and with Indian tribes. And that federal power extended through that Commerce Clause. Now, in 1790, many American leaders and citizens had legitimate respect for what they thought was a both exotic and noble culture. When 28 Choctaw chiefs went to New York to meet with the Washington administration to sign a treaty, they were greeted with a parade and a month of dinners and civic festivals. But regardless of the treaties that ended up out of that conference, the federal government could do very little when the Georgian residents began swarming into territory reserved for the Choctaw. The relentless quest of profit turned our legal parchment, in the words of historian Joseph Ellis, into veiled imperialism and a Republican cloak over our imperialist agenda. Well, as the nation grew up and grew westward, greed blazed the Trail of Tears. How many know that term? The Trail of Tears. Yeah, more than half. Good. Good. All went to high school. They do teach that. They don't teach all of it, clearly. In 1824, when the Office of Indian Affairs was transferred auspiciously into the U.S. Department of War, right, our path was pretty clear. In violation of law and treaty obligations, the 5 civilized tribes, that they were paternalistically called, were driven off their lands first by state vigilantes and then eventually by federal troops. Thanks to the 1830 Indian Removal Act, the Muskogee, known as the Creek, along with the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole Indians were all given an offer they couldn't refuse, which was relocate or die. Now, those who tried to refuse had their fences destroyed, their animals killed, their houses burned, and one witness who observed the Choctaw people saw them scourged, quote, scourged, manacled, fettered, and otherwise personally abused until they left. They were forced at gunpoint, often walking barefoot through snowstorms, many, many miles. Men, women, and children dropped dead along the way. De Tocqueville, our European observer, witnessed some of the Choctaw removal, and he wrote, "In the whole scene there was an air of ruin and destruction. something which betrayed a final and irrevocable adieu. One couldn't watch without the feeling one's heart wrung. The Indians were tranquil but somber and taciturn. We watched the expulsion of one of the most celebrated and ancient American peoples. Of the 17,000 Choctaw forced to leave, 6,000 died on the way. Tribes suffered greatly the indignities. They were cheered by white settlers as the best solution to what was called the Indian problem, always defining it, the problem as the other. There was little care put into safety of this trip, or the provisions provided that were inadequate. Some of the ferries that carried Native Americans sank in the river because they were defective, and many Native Americans were forced to pay for their passage on those ferries. Prisoners themselves were forced this. Local people along the route often demanded inflated money from the government to bury the Native Americans that they either murdered themselves or found frozen on the road. Well, after the self-inflicted slaughter known as the Civil War, many Americans returned to the Indian problem, favoring an alternative to genocide again, assimilation of indigenous people into U.S. culture. President Grant hoped for a paternalistic solution like that of Knox in Washington. In his 1871 State of the Union address, he offered the following. He said, "The policy pursued toward the Indians has resulted favorably. Many tribes of Indians have been induced to settle upon reservations, to cultivate the soil, to perform productive labor of various kinds, and to partially accept civilization. They are being cared for in such a way, it is hoped, as to induce those still pursuing old habits of life to embrace the only opportunity which is left them to avoid extermination." Now, some who resisted these inducements earned a rare military victory at Little Bighorn in 1876, but this only led to almost unrelenting warfare. Conveniently, the occupation of the South ended in 1877, and there were thousands of troops ready for a new enemy who were carted out west for what was known as the Indian Wars. And for the next 15 years, the U.S. policy was pacification. Those of you who remember Vietnam heard that term then as well. It's a euphemism used for brutal repression. The symbolic, if not military, climax of the Indian Wars was the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. Dozens of witnesses saw the same thing. Angry, tired, and agitated men, women, and children were surrounded by angry, agitated, and tired soldiers, but the soldiers had Hotchkiss machine guns. And as often happens in these situations, a shove and a yell and a shot led to the slaughter of 350 human beings, 25 of them being U.S. troops, mainly killed by their own bullets. The wounded indigenous were gathered up, they were thrown into wagons, and they were brought up to the Episcopal Church at Pine Ridge and laid down as a makeshift hospital with a banner over the altar reading, "Peace on earth, goodwill towards men." Now, many religious people generally wanted to save the lives and the souls of American Indians. Protestants and Quakers and Catholics actually competed over conversions. Many ex-abolitionists transferred their zeal into trying to save Native Americans. They were called officially Friends of the Indians, and they worked to assimilate tribes into U.S. society. In 1887, the Dawes Act, which was a cornerstone of this policy, broke up the social and economic unity of Native American tribes and forced them to farm on private plots for profit. Policymakers were hoping that this would help create sufficient crop producers in the West and also consumers of everything produced in the East. The previously nomadic warriors were also notably easier to control when tied to a specific piece of land. And the Dawes Act just happened to open up wide tracts of land for railroads, mining, and agriculture. And as a result, the land held by the indigenous people in 1887, when the Dawes Act was passed, went from 138 million acres to 48 million acres by 1934. Now, underlying all of this policy was an aggressive philosophical individualism that challenged traditional relations and communal practices of indigenous peoples. White America's overblown faith in rugged individualism was pressed upon the tribes in a way that we just ignored the wisdom that might have helped us humanize our economy and our ecology. Instead, we followed the path of the words of an Indian Affairs Commissioner at the end of last century, John Oberle, who in the late 1800s said the following words, that every brave had to be, quote, imbued with an exalting egotism of American civilization, so he will say I instead of we, and will say this is mine instead of this is ours. That's U.S. policy talking. How can that not eventually wreak havoc on our own ecological situation? And we did this with a sense of moral superiority. Senator Teller from Colorado pointed this out. He was a somewhat enlightened senator who said that this was a naked attempt to, quote, despoil the Indians of their land and to make them vagabonds on the face of the earth. The provisions for the apparent benefit of the Indians, he said, are but the pretext to get the lands and occupy them. If this were done in the name of greed, it would be bad enough, but to do it in the name of humanity is infinitely worse. So U.S. assimilation policy continued to tear the soul out of indigenous culture. In 1883, the U.S. Code of Indian Offenses was passed, and it suppressed evil practices like dances, ceremonies, rituals, marriage arrangements. But in some ways, some of the most searing experience that I read about was that came out of the reform efforts of Indian boarding schools. Managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, off-reservation schools assumed that the best thing for young Native Americans was to remake them. So new clothes, new haircuts, new names, new language was all part of this assimilation through total immersion. Richard Henry Pratt, who cut his teeth by managing Native American prisoners in Florida, founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879. This school required reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also vocational training, strict discipline, church attendance, and often grueling and abusive chores. The motto of the Carlisle School was, to civilize the Indian, get him into civilization. To keep him civilized, let him stay. But these kids had very little choice over that. Those kept at Carlisle were maybe lucky because some of the schools further from population centers were even more abusive, full of disease and sexual abuse, as is written in many of the diaries of the ones who survived it. Now today, the choice for indigenous people, especially on the reservations, is still limited, crippled by poverty, unemployment, mental health challenges, addiction. Reservation support systems have been decimated by recent budget cuts. Austerity policy, after all, always starts on the bottom, doesn't it? Never starts on the top. Reservations that people rarely see have virtually no safety net anymore. I read about one in Poplar, Montana, where the school system was rocked by 5 suicides last year, 20 attempts, and they just got their budget slashed so they can't afford a second counselor for the kids. The Indian Health Services, one of the only healthcare options for many Native Americans, will be cut by 8%, and an additional 5% if the sequester goes through. And unlike many of the social net programs for most of the population, the various Indian Health Services is not protected from the sequester, and it serves 2 million people. Current estimates indicate that that will lead to 3,000 less inpatient admissions and 800,000 less outpatient visits in a population that's already battling health issues. And on top of this, how many of those health issues are going to be caused by environmental problems that hit disproportionately Native American populations? Given their reverence towards Earth, again, the irony is palpable. According to an EPA-certified analytic laboratory, water used on the Pine Ridge Reservation contains arsenic, alpha radiation, and other contaminants 18 times the legal limit. The EPA website warns that people who drink water on those reservations have an increased chance of cancer. And on all reservations, you have similar problems with groundwater pollution, toxic waste, invasive mining, clear-cutting forests. Winona LaDuke, who was a vice presidential candidate for the Green Party, said, "While Native people have been massacred and fought, cheated and robbed of their historical lands, today their lands are subject to some of the most intrusive environmental and industrial interventions imaginable." Now, despite incredible roadblocks, Native American scientists and doctors and activists and educators are battling for environmental and social justice for their people. Activists often go to the courts to try to enforce treaty obligations and environmental regulations. More effective solutions might come about if they actually got the land back, legal title to the land. LaDuke, as executive director of the White Earth Land Recovery Project, fights for the lands for the Anishinaabe. Past U.S. policy of breaking up the tribal lands led to them losing 90% of the lands granted to them in treaties. But between 1993 and 2000, LaDuke was able to buy back 1,200 acres for succession back to the tribe. And her policy is to create awareness and support for Native American environmental issues and to develop needed financial and political resources for the survivable and sustainable Native communities. Well, closer to Philadelphia, Lenape Chief Shelley DePaul does similar work to try to educate the rest of us. She did some at a workshop for the children at Camp Linden last summer. Along with other tribal leaders, Chief DePaul does not anticipate getting the land back here on the eastern seaboard that was dominated by the Lenape. They lived in southern New York, eastern Pennsylvania, all of New Jersey, and northern Delaware. It's one of the oldest tribes on the continent. It's divided into 3 clans: the Munsee clan in the north, or the Wolf clan, the Unami, or the Turtle clan, and the Ulawang, or Turkey clan, in the southern parts. They still rely on collective and matriarchal government structures today. When Europeans arrived, the Lenape, who were a peace-loving tribe, were again remarkably generous. And had they not been, it's quite possible the colonists would not have survived those first few decades, and this history of this continent would be remarkably different. To honor that, I support the Lenape Treaty of Renewed Friendship, which recognizes the Lenape as the original inhabitants of our area and the spiritual keepers of the Delaware River. The signers commit themselves to supporting the Lenape as they're able by offering either political or financial support or by hosting cultural or environmental events. So maybe we can join in Chief DePaul's efforts in her environmental area where she's fighting against fracking and for food justice. There are lots of opportunities. But last week she shared with me the point of that treaty is mainly about relationship, about partnership, about mutual support. The treaty has the following words that sound like ethical humanism to me. It says, "May these partnerships serve to heal the past, give direction for today, and brighten the future as we move forward. Learning from the mistakes of our local forefathers, may we together bring light and cultural and geographical significance to Pennsylvania, preserving the natural history for all our children." Now, ethical humanism does not have the belief in the afterlife, so working for the future means working for our children and their children, and so on for 7 generations and more. We do it out of respect for the chain of life that emerged out of primordial soup, and that will continue as long as our planet is alive. And our sense of connection to something greater doesn't relate to some supernatural beyond, but to the teeming life all around us that indigenous populations know better than us. Ethical humanism shares this philosophy in the commitment to an interconnected web. This connection resonates through the words of Chief Seattle. You may have heard this, it's one of the more famous. He said, "Teach your children what we have taught our children. that the earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. If men spit on the ground, they spit upon themselves. This we know. The earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. This we know. All things are connected like the blood which unites one family. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. We did not weave this web of life. We are merely a strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. Isn't that what's missing from Western civilization? Gandhi was once asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he said, "I think it would be a good idea." We have cut ourselves off from nature, and we're the worst for it. The book, The Continuum Concept by Jean Lidloff, argues that we have severed our connection, not just to nature, but to the entire evolutionary process and our needs and our nurturance, that if we followed naturally, we would be more at one with the planet. And we're left with a modern plethora of psychological ills and ecological catastrophe. Our survival may depend on the deceptively simple message of interconnectedness. And this wisdom is gifted to us through stories. Again, often unappreciated by rationalists, very certain written culture people like myself. In a book called Keepers of the Earth, the author points that the primary object of storytelling is to promote a realization of wonder and delight. We miss that. Storytellers engage deep emotions, and perhaps that's what we need to transform our ecological consciousness. Not far from Camp Linden is a Westchester University office of Paul Morgan, who will be speaking here April 28th, about moving beyond the fallacy of sustainability education. And his theme is going to be about how we think that we can have a sustainability education program by just doing business as usual. But he says it's not business as usual. We are in a different stage, and we need transformative approaches to ourselves, to our education, and to how to treat the environment. Maybe a revolution in ecology could be helped by listening to the stories of Indigenous people. One story that stuck with me was in the afterword of Keepers of the Earth, and it was about Swift Eagle, who was an Apache visiting some friends on the Onondaga Reservation in New York, and he encountered some young Native American boys shooting songbirds for fun. Now, had I been caught by my parents doing that, I think I would have been punished, criticized. But Swift Eagle calmly said, "Ah, I see you've been hunting. Pick up your game and come with me." So he took the boys and he helped them build a fire, and he showed them how to cook the birds. And as they sat eating the birds, he told them stories about the planet and about nature, and how they should be grateful for all that the birds and the earth has given them freely, generously. He left the boys with the words, "I understand that you boys must have been very, very hungry to kill those little birds." Now that story demonstrates to me the importance of relationship, because Swift Eagle took the time to connect with the boys, to befriend them. Through relationship, he strengthened their connection with nature. Through interactive, hands-on, and experiential education, he transformed the boys' relation to nature. They learned by doing things like camping skills. They learned biology, zoology, oral tradition, history. They even learned the chemistry of fire building and charcoal. All of this collected wisdom was not dissected and chopped up and placed into different isolated academic areas, but brought down to earth in concrete and interpersonal ways that helped teach ethics and values. The human race, particularly those considered civilized, have gotten very good at dissecting, at specializing, at dividing. But in doing so, we may have lost our way. Keepers of the Earth, the authors say, the artificial distinctions between fields of study, with natural science alone being divided into botany, zoology, geology, astronomy, and hundreds of other areas, can lead to knowledge that's fragmented. It's like what you learn by dissecting a frog. You know the parts, but you cannot put them together to understand the animal. And in cutting the frog apart, you have killed it. The Ojibwe prayer. Grandfather, look at our brokenness. We know that in all creation only the human family has strayed from the sacred way. We know that we are the ones who are divided. We are the ones who must come back together to walk in the sacred way. Grandfather, Sacred One, teach us love, compassion, and honor, that we may heal the earth and heal each other. Many people today, myself included, don't know how broken we are. I mean, climate deniers are running amok amongst us. We're so distracted, I'm so distracted by all I own, by my busy schedule, that we often forget what matters the most. We don't heed the warnings of Indigenous voices. And we're only beginning to appreciate what's called TEK, which is Traditional Ecological Knowledge, a term I didn't know about until I looked on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on their website. They call TEK the knowledge held by Indigenous cultures about their immediate environment and cultural practices that build on that knowledge. It includes details about plants and animals and natural phenomena that is collected in a holistic manner and is contributed to scientific ecology. It's connected to real life, to the earth that we walk upon. I admitted I'd never been an outdoors person. A week ago I sang about, or a couple of weeks ago, about not being a gardener. I like walks in the woods, but my appreciation for nature is more abstract and detached. Ethical culture leader Kurt Collier, a friend of mine, noticed that when I gave him an essay I wrote a couple of years ago, which I gave here actually about 3 years ago, called Common Ground, The Earth is Inspiration. And it described my appreciation about Earth, but from the perspective of outer space, from photographs by astronauts. Kurt's a gardener, unlike me, and most of his time he focuses on environmental matters. If you look at the AEU Ethical Action Report this month, there's a little story about what Kurt's been up to. But when he read my talk a few years ago, he pointed out an important difference in our perspective, and it's helped me begin to grow in new ways. So I'm going to read a bit of what he wrote to me. He said, this is part of my master's thesis for the Humanist Institute. His response was, as an organic gardener, I am constantly reminded by how much my successes depend solely on my ability to communicate. How much I collaborate with my plants, beneficial insects, and organisms in the soil. To be successful, I consider their wants and needs while I strive to express mine. And through this process, I've learned much about life, about community, and it is my failures and success in the garden that have taught me much about myself. Where I may differ from Hugh is not his focus on reverential feelings for Earth, or his emphasis on its fragility and uniqueness against the emptiness of space, but in a belief that this alone is sufficient as the basis of an ethical approach. In short, like any potential partner, I cannot find myself in an idealized relationship. It's not simply because the other is worthy of my admiration that I seek greater connection. How can I grow in relationship with another if my only feelings for them is awe? I am only called to worship the earth. If I am only called to worship the earth, as Hugh's title suggests, I'm even more unlikely to find myself outside the other. Idealized views of the earth have gotten us into this mess in the first place. Rather, as Michael Pollan suggests in Second Nature, the only thing that will save this wondrous planet is a new role for us, not as worshiper, but as partner in a relationship akin to marriage. I believe Hugh's focus on interconnectedness actually highlights the relational emphasis in ethical culture and our basis for interaction with nature. But interrelatedness is not a passive descriptor of our relationship with nature, but an invitation and the means by which we discover one another. He concludes, I agree with Pollan because I believe it mirrors ethical culture's emphasis on worth-affirming relationships, as a key to generating goodness and nurturing the rest of life. Nature is worthy of our admiration and respect to the extent that we are all beloved partners in it. We must have a new conversation with life, where we continue to assert our hopes, while being mindful of the desires of the other species that cohabit this planet with us. This takes work, all relationships worth having do. And I believe that this is the main basis for an ethical culture approach to our environment. Now, Kurt's perspective dovetails neatly with the perspective of many indigenous people, as well as what I think is at the heart of ethical humanism. As I wrote for the upcoming version of Summer Views about Camp Linden, ethical culture has primarily been an urban affair. It started in cities on the eastern seaboard. And that's why it's even more important that we connect with the soil and the air and the water around us. It's one reason why we hold on to Camp Linden with such tenacity, despite the hours of work it takes. It's one reason why we gave many of you seedlings to take home and nurture to bring back on April 21st to be replanted at Camp Linden. It's why they're up in our kitchen today, growing. It's also one small way we can show our appreciation to the indigenous populations that have suffered at the hands of Western civilization for centuries. Can I turn the volume down on our busy lives long enough to hear the voices of indigenous wisdom? Black Elk, who witnessed near genocide, speaks to us. Hey, lean to hear my feeble voice. At the center of the sacred hoop, you have said that I should make the tree to bloom. With tears running, O Great Spirit, my grandfather, with running eyes I must say, the tree has never bloomed. Here I stand, and the tree is withered. Again I recall the great vision you gave me. It may be that some little root of the sacred tree still lives. Nourish it, then that it may leaf and bloom and fill with singing birds. Hear me that the people may once again find the good and shielding tree. The seedlings in some of your homes and up in our kitchen remind us of the good and shielding tree that Black Elk sees. Let's help it grow again. Thank you very much.